It'd be nice to just hook up to a piece of equipment and go, but judging by the crop size, the moisture conditions, the weed size, you've just got to be very flexible on watching what the cultivator is doing.
One of the most difficult parts of cultivating row crops is knowing what you want to accomplish with the cultivation pass and knowing how to adjust your cultivator to achieve that goal.
I guess we typically adjust our cultivators, I bet, 30 times a year. First thing I'd advise is buy a cordless impact because it's the biggest, handiest tool you'll ever. We're constantly, field to field, we're constantly adjusting cultivators. And whether Dad's running it or I'm running it, I like setting them a different way than he does. So depending on who's running at the time.
There's a lot of geometry involved in setting up equipment. And if you're really picky, you can spend all day setting your cultivator. And if you're like me and you don't know what you're doing when you start, you just hop on it and go because you don't know any better. So, and it takes you years to figure out that that little adjustment will help this thing.
What you want your cultivator to do is cut out the weeds in the middle portion of the row, between the rows, and bury the weeds next to the row or real tight to the row. You'll have kind of a 8 to 10 inch width around the row, or say 5 inches on each side of the row, that is kind of the no man's zone that you can't get a sweep in to cut the weeds. So in that, say 5 inches on each row, that's the challenging where you have to move enough soil to bury those weeds.
I'm checking to make sure the cultivator's running level.
You know, if it's going too deep and throwing some big slabs and knocking plants over.
I'm checking to make sure we're not covering up the plants with the cultivator.
If it's going too shallow and, you know, sliding over top of bigger weeds, just constantly be out looking, scratching your feet in the soil, kicking back and forth, seeing, did I actually cut that weed out? Did I just slide a little loose dirt over him? Is it still rooted into the soil?
You need to know how much dirt you're going to move, and that goes by the depth that you're going. If you go too deep, you're going to throw a lot of dirt, and if the crop is very small, you don't want to throw enough dirt to cover it up and give it a problem from coming on up.
You know, sometimes you can see that weed that looks like it got knocked over, looks like it's broke off. You go back and use your foot and kick the loose dirt around that weed and see that the root's still engaged in the soil. Then you got to go a little bit deeper to make sure you get that cut off or torn out. And you've really got to get out behind after you make a few passes and see what's going on. You know, and get down on your hands and knees, kick around, see exactly how deep it's going if you're getting under the roots. If you're throwing enough soil up against the row, into the row, you can drive a little. If you're not, you can drive a little faster to get it to push a little more dirt in and around the base of the plant to kind of cover some of them small weeds right next to the row.
The depth will make a difference there, and the speed will make a difference there.
You know, the next adjustment is your speed. A little more speed, get the dirt to flow a little bit better.
The amount of weeds that you're burying is dependent on, well, how you set your cultivator, but speed is what throws that dirt. So the more mature your weeds and corn get, the more dirt it takes to bury those weeds if you got a little behind. And you're going to go faster and you feel like you're getting more done because you are.
If you have a little bit bigger weed, then you might need to set it to throw a little bit more dirt to bury your weeds if you got bigger weeds.
One big maintenance that I do on cultivators that often gets overlooked is checking to make sure all your row spacings are correct. Going over your cultivator every year and making sure a unit hasn't slid a ½ inch or an inch, and making sure the center of your planter is the same as your cultivator. Making sure your units on your planter are lined up so that it allows your cultivator to stay lined with your planter. I'll take my cultivator and I'll measure from the center 3-point and make sure my row spacings are right out to the ends. We had one year that nobody checked the row spacings, and I kept getting out of the cab and adjusting one unit. I'm like, man, I'm taking one out. And I came to find out that like half the cultivator wasn't lined up. So it was kind of a big learning curve.
every row, every sweep is different, so every sweep needs to be adjusted separately from others. You can't just take one row and think that every row is going to be exactly the same, set up the same way. It doesn't work, because each sweep's going to act a little bit different than what you think it should act. So your initial setup will take you a little bit longer than probably what you think it's supposed to be. But once you get it all set up, from year to year after that, you'll just have minor things to change, and it shouldn't be that big a deal.
Farmers we talked to said that because cultivators have been cheap over the years, they have different cultivators set up for different jobs that are ready to go when needed.
Now we try and keep a first pass cultivator set up and then have our second pass cultivator ready to go, because we found that through the planting season, when you're second pass cultivating corn, oftentimes your first pass cultivating beans at the same time. And so a lot of times you need both set up ready to go at the drop of a hat.
Early on, some farmers use rolling shields or tent shields to protect small crops from being covered up with soil from the cultivator.
I use rolling shields. They seem to work a heck of a lot better.
By putting shields on it so that the dirt flows as close to that plant as possible but can't bury it because of those shields. And some people don't like shields, so they just go super slow so that dirt is just rolling up close to it but not on it.
I use shields the first time, but I take those off or raise them up for the later cultivations so that I can push some dirt underneath the row.
Both Paul, Jaron, and Eric use buffalo cultivators extensively in their systems and like the adjustability of the implement.
Yeah, on a buffalo cultivator, you can kind of change about anything and everything.
You can adjust the pitch of the sweeps. Generally, I don't adjust that too much. I like to have them as flat as I can, but I have to be able to get underneath every last little piece of residue, or I'm gonna plug up if I don't.
You can adjust the top link of your tractor to set the cultivator back on its back farther or make it run on its nose farther, which in turn will set that back sweep deeper or shallower. And it's a little bit relation to the angle of the sweep as well with that tractor top link.
There's a straight coulter right ahead of that sweep. Sometimes I have to adjust those because I have to get all of that residue sliced right ahead of that sweep, or again, I'll plug up.
With the buffalo sweep, you want to make sure that your sweep is cutting clear out to the edge of the sweep.
The main adjustment there is on that back sweep to get it to run kind of fairly shallow and flat to undercut the weeds without getting down into the wet, typically wet, muckier dirt that could slab and fight you in the future.
This is a John Deere AT40 front mount cultivator. It's a 4-row cultivator. But as far as adjustments, you can adjust your rolling shields up or down based off of the height of your crop. So obviously earlier on it's going to be way lower than it is up higher. Other adjustments would be on the sweeps themselves. There's a bolt here with adjustments. You can adjust the angle of the sweep to be more aggressive or less aggressive. Also, your gauge, your depth, starting depth anyway for your whatever. And then the next adjustments would be the shanks themselves. You can adjust each shank up and down individually as you need to. You can also adjust these shanks to be turned one way or the other. Just to, if you get too much dirt to going one way, you can just give it a little bit of a tweak one way or the other. You can adjust in or out, closeness to the row, away from the row. Another nice adjustment on these is that each row has its own adjustment for how high you pick it up, and you can do point rows with it. You can adjust this one to be down a little bit more, and when you go into a point row, you slowly pick it up. It'll pick up, and each row will slowly come up individually, so you can do point rows a little bit better. Also, there's a pressure spring here that if you need to put pressure down for harder ground to get it to go on the ground, you can do that too.
The International, there really isn't hardly any adjustment to it. I can move the shanks away from the row a little bit, but that's about it.
Typically I'm around 4 inches away from the row. It could some sweeps could be 6 inches away. It all depends how the sweep acts. Each row is different. I set up each row to try and accomplish the same dirt flow. So not every sweep's gonna be, you can't set every sweep, say 3 inches away from the row. It just isn't gonna work. Each sweep's gonna act a little bit different.
I leave more of a space in there because I just like to be able to go a little faster and not have to have a crook in my neck so much from watching exactly where I'm going all the time.
Some guys will move, when the seedlings are younger, they will move their shanks in closer to the row, and other guys just leave them the same. They just don't want to mess with that, so they just leave them the way they are all year, and they just depend on throwing dirt to kind of modify that.
You can change that, and you can get wider cultivator shoes too. So the wider shoes, you can have like 3 of them in a row running, and if you have 10 inches wide in the center and the back, and the other 2 smaller ones up close. But the problem is you need to be a really steady and straight driver. If you don't have GPS, which my GPS means going pretty straight, which has nothing to do with a satellite in the air, it's hanging onto the steering wheel and making it go pretty straight. And then the speed that you go is another thing. So if you get off row or a little bit, and if you're dreaming about something that you shouldn't be dreaming about, you can take out a lot of corn or beans in a very short time. So the speed you go and your accuracy will decide how close you want to put those cultivator shoes. You can get them right up close to that thing, but you have to be right on the money or you're going to tear out your crop. So if you back them off a little bit and you've got a little more space, that's when you want to have them digging a little deeper, throwing a little more dirt, so they'll throw the dirt into the row rather than have that piece of metal going right next to your crop.
When crops get bigger and begin to establish a bigger root system, some farmers try to avoid cutting those roots with the cultivator, a phenomenon known as root pruning.
Root pruning can be a problem, especially when the crop gets up and it's getting really tall because it's sending the roots out. And then you shouldn't have your cultivator shoes very close because you're going to start pruning roots on there.
When the crop gets bigger, many farmers will use flow shields to help direct soil that is being thrown by the cultivator into the row to cover up in-row weeds.
I kind of make my own accessories for this a little bit better, especially when the corn gets a lot taller, mostly knee-high or taller. I'll end up putting these down here behind the sweeps, and what it'll do is the dirt will come up the sweep and it'll throw the dirt a little bit more and get up, knock some weeds down, bury some weeds a little bit better. That's kind of the nice thing about this type of cultivator is you can make your own accessories and make them work for your situation anyway.
We also run it's called a flow shield on the shanks. Depends on which shank we'll actually put a flow shield on. But what that does is as the soil comes up your shank, it hits that shield and then the shield diverts it towards your row. And so I like that because one, it changes where your dirt is landing. It's not just getting thrown up and just kind of going wherever. It's actually directing it into your plant. And that one will run once your beans are quite a bit taller, so you're trying to push dirt up under the row if you can.
Typically when corn gets about knee-high or higher is about the good time to do it, because these things will throw dirt pretty good.
Weather conditions are especially challenging in organic farming, and farmers tend to adjust cultivation equipment to cope with less than ideal conditions.
The wet soil is the worst thing that an organic farmer can have, because that doesn't allow him to get out and do the work that he needs to do when he needs to do it. And timing is one of the most important things in organic soil, and having a good organic crop is making the timing that the soil is right and the time of the year is right, and everything has to work together. So if you have heavier soils, You may have to hit them with a little more of the cultivation prior to planting to get them loosened up and aired up so they can dry out easily. And because if you have heavy soils and you plant in a wet, heavy soil, your plants will not do well at all. It's really tough to get anything to do well in a heavy soil that is wet. So if you have a drought, you're better off as an organic farmer than if you have just the right amount of rain or too much.
I think the pitch, when it's wet or dry, you'll play with the pitch of your sweep and the depth, as well as probably the amount of weight you're sticking on from your toolbar and your tractor, depending on whether or not you're wet or dry in your soil conditions.
If the soil's wet, you got to be really careful. As the soil comes up the shank of the cultivator, it's going to want to ribbon and slab. And then those slabs, when you come through, if it's the first cultivation, if you come through again, then when you move those slabs, they're going to be just like sliding bricks around. And then potentially exist there that you're going to knock off or break off a lot of your crop the next time you come through, because those big wet slabs of dirt are not going to crumble or fall apart. They're going to be there the next time still as big slabs. And then as you push those slabs into the row, you're going to have a hard time doing that gently enough to not break off the corn or soybeans. Or soybeans, if you cultivate too wet and too deep and you've got a bunch of slabs laying around, when you go to harvest those beans, it's going to could cause you a lot of trouble with your bean head sliding over them, or you're going to suck a lot of them through the combine and get a lot of dirt into your sample.
You don't want to be going through wet ground where it comes up lumpy or clumpy, or the dirt just doesn't want to break apart. You don't want to be cultivating through that. It can be kind of a not good situation when you want to cultivate again, because you're just going to create lumps that are just dry and never break apart.
In wet conditions, I might go a little lighter, just so you don't create that slabbing effect coming off the sweep.
So when it's wet, you got to be careful not to go too deep or too fast where you're creating slabs.
You had a hard pounding rain that it really wants to throw dirt, that you need to change it to be sweep to be less aggressive.
I try to just run my bar fairly level. And just kind of watch and see how the sweeps, whether they're slabbing. If you're a wetter, sometimes you'll run that sweep a little shallower.
If it's dry, that can kind of cause the issue as well of baking it. If the soil is really dry and hard, sometimes it's a challenge to get the cultivator to go in the ground.
If it's really dry and you're able to go a little deeper, I'll pitch in a little more.
It can sometimes want to slide up, and that's where the buffaloes kind of shine as well, that you can tip that. If you do run into the case where the cultivator won't go in the ground, you can tip the sweeps ahead a little bit farther and make them dig in.
Usually in drier conditions, we'll run the cultivator a little bit heavier. But yeah, a lot of it determines on how the dirt's moving towards the row. If I can do more deeper tillage and not damage a plant, I'll try and do it. If it's too wet, a lot of times you're just not going to get a good kill with the cultivator. With that said, I still will cultivate if it's wet. If it's like this year, we had really wet soils that were compacted, and we actually increased the health of our corn by cultivating and aerating the soil and just getting some air and oxygen down to the root. I like to call that motivating. It's not very fun to do, but sometimes you have to do it.
If you're going to text when you're out there, you're probably not going to have a very good stand of population because you probably text out most of your beans and corn wherever you're texting. So don't text and drive.